Okay, so the major organs of the respiratory system are meant to provide oxygen to body tissues for cellular respiration, remove the waste product carbon dioxide, and then also help maintain an acid-base balance. Parts of the respiratory system are meant for non-vital functions, such as sensing odors, producing speech, and for straining, such as during childbirth or coughing. Okay. We need to know that the respiratory system it can be divided several different ways. It can be divided anatomically, or it can be divided functionally. Anatomically, it's divided into an upper respiratory tract, and then it's also divided into a lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract is supposed to be everything from the larynx upward. So that's going to include the nose, the nasal cavity, the sinuses, the pharynx, the larynx, and that's it. Just everything above the larynx. Then the lower respiratory tract is basically everything from the larynx down. So, okay, so that would be like the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, the alveoli, and then also the lungs. Okay, then it can also be divided differently. It can be divided functionally. So functionally, it's divided into a conduction zone and then a respiratory zone. So the conduction zone, we need to know that that's supposed to be everywhere where air is flowing, but that there is no gas exchange. Everywhere where air flows, but there is no gas exchange. Okay, so that's going to include the nose, the nasal cavity, the sinuses, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, and bronchi and bronchioles. Right, the major functions of the conduction zone are to provide a route for the incoming and outgoing air, removing the debris and pathogens from the incoming air, and then also warm and humidify the incoming air. The way that the conduction zone is able to do that, the warm, moisten, and humidify, is by through the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelia. So the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelia, we need to know that that's going to have lots of goblet cells, and the goblet cells are supposed to trap mucus, like the mucus is meant to trap particles, and then the cilia are meant to help sweep the mucus trap particles usually towards the throat. And then from there, it can just be swallowed. Okay, then now let's take a look at each of the respiratory structures. Okay, so for the first structure is going to be the nose and the nasal passages. So the nasal passages are supposed to contain conchae. The conchae are supposed to be scroll-shaped bones that are lined with ciliated mucous membranes. And then also meatuses that are supposed to expand the surface area of the cavity. And it's supposed to help warm and humidify the incoming air and also remove debris and pathogens from the incoming air. Right, this is a good picture. It shows specifically the nasal conchae. And right, like I said, the nasal conchae are supposed to expand the surface area. Okay, now for the pharynx. We need to know that the pharynx is supposed to be the throat. And there's actually 3 different sections to the pharynx. There's a nasopharynx, an oropharynx, and a laryngopharynx. As you can see, the nasopharynx is behind the nose at the very back. The oropharynx is at the back of the mouth. And then the laryngopharynx is down low by the larynx. Okay. Right, and so the pharynx is really, anytime you think pharynx, you should just think throat. Basically, yeah, and every time you think throat, you should think pharynx. That's important to know. Okay, now the larynx is supposed to be the vocal cords. So we need to know that the larynx, right, like I said, does contain the vocal cords, but it has other pieces of cartilage in it that are important. There's a thyroid cartilage, a cricoid cartilage, and then also an epiglottic cartilage. So the thyroid cartilage is the largest piece of cartilage that makes up the larynx. And the thyroid cartilage, it has a special tip um, called the laryngeal prominence. And the laryngeal prominence is supposed to be the Adam's apple. It's supposed to be the Adam's apple. And so it's going to be found in both men and women. But it's just larger in men than it is in women. Okay, now let's see, the cricoid cartilage. So we need to know that the cricoid cartilage oh, the cricoid cartilage is just this little piece of cartilage below the thyroid cartilage. And the cricoid cartilage by itself is not that important. It's actually this little ligament between the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage that's important, called the cricothyroid ligament. And the cricothyroid ligament is important because this is cut during an emergency tracheotomy. Okay, and so right, basically that would be necessary if there was an object blocking somebody's airway up here, and then the air can't get down past the object. So we can make an incision right at this ligament and then use that to insert an endotracheal tube. Okay. Right, then the next part of the larynx is the epiglottis. Okay, so the epiglottis is supposed to be this flap that folds down over the larynx and the trachea and is supposed to prevent food from entering the larynx and the trachea. Okay, so far we need to understand the order. Some people get confused about the order of the pharynx, the larynx, and the epiglottis. So we need to know that the pharynx basically first the pharynx is higher than the larynx. So first there should be the pharynx, and then actually it would be the epiglottis after that, and then there'd be the no, or yeah, there'd be the epiglottis. I think that's this flap down up right here. That's the epiglottis. And then the rest of the larynx is down there. So it's pharynx, epiglottis, larynx. Where'd it go? There it is. Okay, next let's take a look at the trachea. So the trachea is supposed to be the windpipe. So, right, if you ever, that's our common name for it, is to say the windpipe, but technically it's supposed to be the trachea. We do need to know that the trachea is supposed to have C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage. And so these C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage, they're supposed to help hold the trachea open all the time in order to prevent it from collapsing. Then all lining the inside the trachea, there should be more pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelia with goblet cells. And again, they're supposed to, the mucus is supposed to trap, and then the cilia is supposed to help sweep. Okay, then the trachea, we also need to know that the trachea is supposed to be anterior, or in other words, in front of the esophagus. So that's actually why when you feel the front of your throat, you're actually feeling the trachea, not the esophagus. Okay, then the trachea, if we think about the trachea as similar to like a tree trunk, then the bronchi are supposed to be the big branches that extend out from the tree trunk. So the bronchi, we need to know that they also are going to have more rings of cartilage, again, to help hold them open all the time. And then again, they're going to have more pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelia with goblet cells. And basically the goblet cells are supposed to make mucus again. And then, right, the mucus traps debris and pathogens. And then the cilia are going to sweep the mucus trap particles towards the throat. And then from there, they can just be swallowed. So the bronchi, we need to know that the bronchi, they're going to continue to branch, and they're going to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until they become bronchioles. Okay, so we need to know that the bronchioles, what's really important to know about them is that they do not contain any cartilage at all. None. They don't have any cartilage. And instead, they just contain smooth muscle. So the smooth muscle, we need to know that the smooth muscle is gonna help with broncho um, constriction and bronchodilation. And we're going to talk about the bronchoconstriction and bronchodilation later. And that's it for the conduction zone. So the conduction zone stops at the bronchioles. Okay, now at the end of the bronchioles, there's the alveoli. So the alveoli is where we're going to have the gas exchange, and it's also the beginning of the respiratory zone. So this is supposed to be the respiratory zone. Okay, so right, as I mentioned, the alveoli is necessary for gas exchange. And there's actually several different types of cells for the alveoli. There's alveolar type 1, alveolar type 2, and then alveolar macrophages. So we need to know that the type 1 alveolar cells, those are the ones that are responsible for the gas exchange. They're the simple squamous epithelial cells. And they are supposed to, like I said, be responsible for the gas exchange. Then the type 2 alveolar cells, we need to know that the type 2 alveolar cells, they are going to make an important substance known as a surfactant. And so we need to know the surfactant is supposed to be a substance that reduces surface tension in the alveoli. Because surface tension would actually cause the alveoli to collapse. And so, right, the surfactant is supposed to prevent it from collapsing. Then the third type of cell is an alveolar macrophage. So we need to know that the alveolar macrophages, their job is to just roam around and they're going to eat dead debris and bacteria from getting down into the alveoli, or that have gotten down into the alveoli. Okay, now let's take a look at the bronchodilation, bronchoconstriction, which I did mention that we were going to talk about. Okay, so for cartilage, as we mentioned, we need to know that the cartilage is going to be present in the trachea and the bronchi, but then by the time that you get down into the bronchioles, like as we mentioned, there's not going to be any cartilage at all, and instead there's just going to be smooth muscle. And so the smooth muscle, as I mentioned, that's supposed to um, help with bronchodilation. and then bronchoconstriction. The bronchodilation is going to occur during the fight or flight response, or in other words, sympathetic stimulation. Because during the fight or flight response or the sympathetic response, essentially what's going to be happening is that your body is going to want to try to bring as much oxygen as fast as possible into the lungs in order to be able to get that to the muscles as fast as possible so that you can get ready to run away or fight off the predator. So it's going to be opening up those bronchioles to get more oxygen down into the lungs. Okay. Then bronchoconstriction, that's going to occur during asthma attacks or allergic reactions. Right? Basically, the bronchioles, when they become super narrow, when they become very narrow, this is actually one reason why people may hear wheezing during an asthma attack or an allergic response is because the bronchioles are so narrow, and as the air tries to pass through that tiny narrow opening, then it creates that wheezing, whistling sound. Okay. Right, now let's take a look at the lungs. There's definitely going to be a right lung and then a left lung. The right lung, we need to know that that actually has 3 lobes, and then the left lung only has 2. So that's just a random fact to know. Okay, then we need to know that covering the lungs, there's supposed to be the pleura. So for the pleura, there's supposed to be 2 different layers. There's a visceral pleura and then a parietal pleura. So the visceral, anytime you think visceral, you should think organ. It's like right up against an organ. And then the parietal is a little bit more external. The parietal pleura is going to be against the thoracic cavity. And then against the diaphragm. Let me actually show you in the picture. So this would be the visceral pleura, right up against the lung. And then this is the parietal pleura, more external. And you can see that it's against the rib and the rib muscles. But on this bigger diagram, the parietal pleura would be all along here, along the outside, but also down here against the diaphragm, against the heart, and against the sternum, like that. Okay, then after that, right in between, well, first of all, we need to know that both the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura, they are going to be making a type of fluid called serous fluid. And serous fluid is supposed to reduce friction. Okay, so, but in addition to reducing friction, we also need to know that the serous fluid is also going to make everything very sticky. So you can almost think about like a wet t-shirt. If you have a wet t-shirt, the two layers of the fabric are going to cling to each other and stick to each other. And that's exactly what the serous fluid is going to do too. It's going to help um, everything stick together. It helps the visceral pleura stick to the parietal pleura. Also, if you think about it, if you tried to put the shirt on, it would stick to your skin. So that's how the serous fluid is going to help the visceral pleura stick to the lung. And it also will help the parietal pleura stick to the thoracic cavity and the diaphragm. In between the two, in between the visceral and parietal pleura, there is supposed to be a space. Let's see if I can line this back up again. Oh well, that's good enough. In between the visceral and parietal pleura, there's supposed to be a space, and that's called the pleural space, also sometimes known as the pleural cavity. And that's where some of the serous fluid is going to be located. Okay, and then right now, right, so like I said, that's where the serous fluid is going to be located. We already talked about the serous fluid, that it reduces friction, but then it also is going to make everything very sticky and help everything stick together, stay together. Right now, let's take a look at some of the important terms. So we need to know that ventilation is just supposed to be the movement of air. I try to think about like an air vent, because if you think about an air vent in a room, It's just where air is moving into or out of a room, but nothing really else is happening. Then once air is in the once air is in the lungs, there needs to be an exchange, a gas exchange. So let me write this out. We have the alveoli and then the blood. So oxygen from the alveoli needs to be given to the blood. And then carbon dioxide from the blood needs to be given to the alveoli. Okay, so that exchange that's going to occur is supposed to be called external respiration. So let me write that. So the external respiration is supposed to be the gas exchange that's occurring at the alveoli. Okay, and then the blood becomes oxygenated. So now the blood is oxygenated. The oxygenated blood travels back to the heart via pulmonary veins, and then the heart will pump the oxygenated blood out through the aorta to the rest of the body. And then once it gets to the body tissues, once again, there's going to need to be another exchange that occurs. So we'll have tissues and then blood. So the blood is carrying oxygen, so that oxygen is going to be given to the tissues, and then carbon dioxide from the tissues needs to be given to the blood. So now that exchange that occurs is called internal respiration. So the exchange that occurs at the tissue level is the internal respiration. Okay, then once the cells have the oxygen, they're going to use the oxygen for cellular respiration. Okay, so the cellular respiration, that's supposed to be the process of taking glucose plus oxygen and making carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. So this is why our body needs oxygen. Is because of cellular respiration. Our bodies are not going to be able to produce energy unless we have oxygen for cellular respiration. Okay, then now let's take a look at the process of inspiration. To understand about the process of inspiration or expiration, we need to know two properties of gases. So we need to know that gases will always move from areas of higher pressure to areas of lower pressure. And we also need to know that pressure and volume are always going to be opposites. So whenever volume goes up, pressure goes down. And whenever volume goes down, pressure goes up. You could almost think about how, like if you have a very tiny room, but you try to put a lot of people in there, the pressure between the people is going to be really high. So that's how a small volume results in a high pressure. Versus if you have a really huge room with a large volume, the pressure is very small. The people aren't like cramped and close together. The pressure between the people is very, very low. Okay, now let's take a look at what happens specifically during inspiration. So in the process of inspiration, we need to know that there are two main muscles. There's the diaphragm and then the external intercostals. When the diaphragm contracts and moves downward, or when the diaphragm contracts, it moves downward. And let me actually, it's gonna draw the diaphragm. We need to know that the diaphragm, when it's relaxed, it actually has this very curved part, or it has a curved shape to it, and it sits pretty high. And then remember, right up against the diaphragm is the parietal pleura, and it's stuck to the diaphragm because that's serous fluid. And then stuck to the parietal pleura is the visceral pleura, and it's going to be stuck to the parietal pleura because of the serous fluid as well. And then stuck to the visceral pleura is the lung. Again, because the serous fluid is going to help the visceral pleura stick to the lung. And let's say that the rest of the lung looks like this. So this is when everything is relaxed. No inspiration has occurred yet. This is when it's just relaxed. So what happens is that when the diaphragm contracts, this part is going to move downward, and the diaphragm is going to flatten out. So it's going to move, it's going to get pulled downward, and it's going to become very flat. And then when that happens, when the diaphragm contracts and pulls downward, that's going to pull on the parietal pleura. And the parietal pleura will then pull on the visceral pleura. And then the visceral pleura pulls on the lung. So the bottom edge of the lung gets pulled downward. And so you can see that the space inside the lung has gotten a lot larger. This is when it's contracted. So the volume, the space inside the lung has gone up, and then the pressure inside the lung, therefore, has gone down because pressure and volume are always opposites. So when volume goes up, pressure goes down. Okay, and so air always wants to flow to areas where there's lower pressure. And so because the pressure is now lower inside the lung, that's why air would flow in. Okay, that's right. That's how air flows in. And then the external intercostals, those are just going to help assist. Those are going to pull the ribs up and out. And then by pulling the ribs up and out, that again is going to pull on the parietal pleura. The parietal pleura is going to pull on the visceral pleura. And then the visceral pleura is going to pull on the lung again. So, and then that's going to increase the volume, which is then going to decrease the pressure. Okay, then we need to know what happens during expiration. So it's extremely important to know that expiration is actually passive, meaning that all that your body has to do is relax. So basically, the reverse is going to happen here. After inspiration, everything starts off contracted. Oops. We'll start off contracted, and then all that will happen is that the diaphragm, when it relaxes, it's going to move back up and in. And for the external intercostals, when they relax, then the ribs are going to move back down and in. And then as they move back down and in, then everything is going to, like, the volume is going to decrease in both places. And as the volume decreases, you can see that the space inside the lung gets smaller. So the volume goes down, and therefore the pressure goes up. Well, air flows to areas of lower pressure. It's going to want to flow to areas of lower pressure. So, because the pressure inside the lung is increasing and air wants to flow to areas of lower pressure, it flows out. And it's going to leave the lungs. Okay. Some other special terms we need to know about include resistance and compliance. So, resistance is actually going to make it more difficult for gases to flow. And then compliance will make it easier for gases to flow. Compliance is all about stretchiness. The higher the compliance, then the more that the lungs can stretch, and therefore that would increase the volume and then decrease the pressure. Okay. Then we also need to know about chemoreceptors. So respiratory rate and depth are controlled by chemoreceptors. Or I'm sorry, they're controlled by the pons in the medulla oblongata. But the pons in the medulla oblongata, they are the ones that are going to get their information from the chemoreceptors. Okay, so we need to know that there's two different types of chemoreceptors. There's peripheral and central. So for peripheral chemoreceptors, those are located inside of major arteries. Right, specifically the aortic arch and the carotid artery. And then the central chemoreceptors, we need to know that those are located in the brain. And they're going to, both of them will actually monitor the levels of carbon dioxide. And so if the carbon dioxide levels start to get too high, then these chemoreceptors are going to send signals to the pons in the medulla oblongata and let them know that the carbon dioxide levels are getting too high. And then the medulla oblongata is going to tell the lungs, or the pons, the pons will tell the lungs to speed up the respiratory rate to get rid of the carbon dioxide. Okay, now let's skip that for a minute. Let's take a look at transport of gases. So we need to know that oxygen is transported primarily through erythrocytes. Erythrocytes are red blood cells. And then the red blood cells, right, the erythrocytes, they contain hemoglobin. And so hemoglobin is supposed to be a protein subunit. it's made up of 4 protein subunits, and each protein subunit is going to have a heme, and then each heme is connected to an iron. And so each iron, though, can carry 4 oxygens. So let me actually write that. We have being oxygen, 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 oxygen. So because each iron can carry an oxygen, then technically that means the hemoglobin can carry up to 4 oxygens at a time. Okay, the thing is, right, is that when all 4 oxygens are on a hemoglobin, then that's when the hemoglobin is called saturated. And then when some of the irons are missing a hemoglobin, then that's when hemoglobin is just called partially saturated. Okay, and then the last thing before we have to stop is for carbon dioxide can be transported 3 ways. It can be transported as dissolved carbon dioxide, as bicarbonate, or as carbonaminohemoglobin. So carbonaminohemoglobin sounds scary, but really all that is just carbon dioxide attached to hemoglobin. That's it. But not much of the carbon dioxide is transported that way. We need to know that most carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate. Okay, well, I'll just